Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 166, Henry IV, Part 1. Nothing can seem foul to those who win. Last time, characters concerned with commerce, trade, wealth, and not a little love took Shakespeare to Venice for a mix of almost tragedy and comedy, some would say almost comedy. His delight in mixing genres continued with his next offering, where he moved to the popular genre of the history play, but mixed the retelling of a national story with a strong dose of comedy and, in doing so, gave us one of, if not the greatest of his comic creations. It is the mixture of genres, character styles, and poetry and prose that make the Henry IV plays two of his best in most opinions, and some of his most popular. Both parts are full-length plays, so for this episode I'm going to concentrate on the first part, but of course I'll be following up next time with part 2. As with Richard II, this play handles some complex English history as it examines the relationship between the king, his son, and the powerful Percy family. After the deposition of Richard II, Henry ruled for 14 years until his death. Having ended Richard II with Henry's accession to the throne and Richard's death in prison, Shakespeare opens this play just a few years later, but with a vision of a tired king and a country dissatisfied with his rule. Here is a brief synopsis of the action of the first part of Henry IV. King Henry, weary of civil war and in an echo of his promise at the end of Richard II, resolves to take an expedition to the Holy Land, but has to put his plans aside when he hears that, on the Welsh border, Lord Mortimer has been captured by the rebel Owen Glendower. Meanwhile, in the north, Hotspur, the son of the Earl of Northumberland, has defeated the Scots led by the Earl of Douglas. The king compares the brave Hotspur to his son Hal, who is wasting his time in the taverns in bad company. However, Hotspur withholds the prisoners he took in the field, which are due to the king, until the ransom is paid for Mortimer, who is Hotspur's brother-in-law, actions which anger the king. In Eastcheap, Prince Hal, Falstaff and Poins plan to rob some travellers. After Falstaff has left, Hal and Poins plot to rob Falstaff and his companions of the gains as a joke. Alone, Hal discloses his true attitude towards his drinking companions and declares that, when the time is right, he will drop them. The king dismisses Worcester, Hotspur's uncle, from the court and continues to refuse to pay any ransom for Mortimer, demanding the prisoners due to him immediately. The disgruntled lords reveal that Mortimer had once been proclaimed heir apparent by Richard II, perhaps explaining why Henry is so reluctant to see him released. Annoyed by Henry's ingratitude and afraid that they will never be safe while he is on the throne, the Percys plot rebellion. Hotspur will enlist the support of the Scots by releasing his prisoners without ransom, while Northumberland will make advances to the disgruntled Archbishop of York, before they all then join with Mortimer and Glendower to take on the king. Falstaff and his friends rob the travellers as planned, but are then chased off by the disguised Hal and Poins, who take the stolen goods and money. Back in Eastcheap, Poins and Hal tease the tavern servant Francis, before Falstaff, on his return, berates them for having fled from the scene of the robbery, and boasts outrageously of his own bravery in the face of the men who in turn robbed him. Hal reveals the deception to Falstaff, who protests that he was in on the joke all the time. News arrives of the rebellion in the country, but before they answer the summons, Hal and Falstaff play act as king and prince. A sheriff arrives investigating the robbery. Hal hides Falstaff, but says that he will repay the money and send his companions to war, with Falstaff being given command of an infantry unit. Meanwhile, in Wales, Hotspur, Mortimer and Glendower discuss dividing up the country between them, but quarrel over the fairness of the partitions. It is agreed that Mortimer, Hotspur and Douglas will face the king's army near Shrewsbury, and Glendower will join them later. In Westminster, the king harangues Hal for his loss of reputation, who swears that he will then redeem himself at Hotspur's expense. As the battle lines are drawn, Hal repays the stolen money. Hotspur hears that Northumberland is sick and that Glendower has been delayed, which diminishes his forces. Falstaff, in the course of recruiting his men, admits that he has taken bribes and only has a very ragtag regiment to lead, made up of beggars. He meets Westmoreland and Hal in Warwickshire, and they hurry to join the king's army. Blunt is sent to the rebel camp to sue for peace, and the following day Worcester and Vernon visit the king's camp to discuss terms and rehearse their grievances. Hal proposes that he should fight in single combat with Hotspur, and the king offers peace to the rebels if they will lay down their weapons. But Worcester doesn't pass on the king's offer, and battle commences. Douglas, mistaking Blunt for the king, kills him. The king and Douglas fight, but Hal beats Douglas off. Falstaff fights with Douglas, but then falls, feigning death. Hal kills Hotspur, and a revived Falstaff stabs Hotspur's corse, bears it off, and later takes the credit for killing him. The rebels are defeated. Worcester and Vernon are taken away for execution, but Douglas is released by Hal on account of his bravery on the field. As the play ends, John of Lancaster, Hal's brother, and the Earl of Westmoreland turn towards York to engage Northumberland and the Archbishop, while the King and Hal head for Wales to deal with Mortimer and Glendower. The date of the composition of Henry IV Part I is usually accepted as 1596 or 1597, supported by the fact that the character of Falstaff was being commented on by 1597. But the earliest recorded performance was in March 1600. Court records show this was for the guest of honour, the Flemish ambassador to Elizabeth's court, and further performances at court in 1612 and 1625 indicate the play's enduring popularity. That is also supported by the fact that, based on the number of reprints, it was Shakespeare's most popular play in print. A first quarto edition was printed in 1598, following registration with the Stationers' Company earlier that year. In that edition, the title is given as The History of Henry IV with his Battle of Shrewsbury against Henry Hotspur of the North and the conceited mirth of Sir John Falstaff. So Falstaff was already being seen as a main draw for the popularity of the play. There was likely 2 further quartos published that year, although only fragments survive of these, and then a further 8 editions up to 1692. It is with the first folio in 1623 that the play gets named formally as the first part of Henry IV. The rendering of the play there follows the 1613 quarto edition, with a removal of all oaths in line with the 1606 Act to restrain the abuses of players, which forbade the speaking of profanity on the stage. A single play version of parts 1 and 2 is also the earliest surviving manuscript of a complete Shakespeare play. The Dearling manuscript, now held as part of the Folger collection in Washington, D.C., is thought to originate from about 1623 and represent a cut-down version of the play for private or amateur performances, probably held at the home of Sir Edward Dearling, a politician and collector of books and manuscripts, who was also the first recorded purchaser of the first folio. His account book records that he purchased 2 copies on the 5th of December 1623. As with the previous history plays, Shakespeare's source was Holingshed's Chronicles, with some additional elements taken from Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York. The play has been much admired in general and in 2 areas in particular. For the first time, Shakespeare handled equally balanced history and comedy within one play, and does it with a sure hand. This is a play crafted by a playwright of growing confidence and experience. Despite it being a play covering the big moments of sweeping history, the structure allows for each plot and subplot to follow on logically and with pace. Also much admired is that within that structure there is space for the distinctive voices of the different characters to display themselves. Shakespeare elected to use a mixture of verse and prose for this play, giving the aristocratic characters, and Hotspur in particular, a very chivalric tone. Falstaff and his companions in the tavern speak in prose, in what seems like very realistic speech patterns, and all very different from the idealism of the knights supporting and opposing the king. Hal stands out as the character who comfortably operates in both worlds, making him in some ways the pivotal character of the play. King Henry himself is a relatively minor character, but his opening speech sets the scene and reminds the audience of the historical situation that we are in. His reference to visiting the Holy Land to vanquish the Turks reminds us of his pledge at the end of Richard II, and, from the off, gives cause to question how trustworthy he has been as a king. Whatever the case there, his attention soon shifts to the internal strife in the country that his seizure of the throne has caused. His attention has to be to these matters now. In reality, Henry was a usurper to the throne, which he was only able to gain through the support of nobles like the Percy family, who disliked Richard and his period of rule. So far, so historically accurate, but Shakespeare follows Holinshed in confusing Edmund Mortimer with his uncle of the same name. It was he who married Glendower's daughter, while his nephew was safely under lock and key in Henry's jail. Henry's delay in responding to Mortimer's ransom, and his reasons for doing so, come from Holinshed. Although the broad brush of historical events are accurate, give or take the condensing of time between the main events of the play, Shakespeare did make some changes. Hotspur was 20 years older than Hal, who was only 16 when he fought the Battle of Shrewsbury. Clearly, Shakespeare liked the idea of the two adversaries appearing to be of similar age. Hotspur was Edmund Percy's real adopted name, indicating that he was always ready for battle, and Shakespeare uses it to mean just that, but also conflates it with a hot-headedness that is only too obvious in Percy's actions and words. Once again, Shakespeare uses familial relationships to underscore the broad action of the play. But in this case, it is not the mothers and wives who provide that focus, but fathers and sons. King Henry's relationship with his son Hal is one version, Hal's with his surrogate father figure Falstaff is another, and Hotspur's relationship with his father, Northumberland, completes the triangle. Henry goes as far as expressing envy to Northumberland at his Henry, who, until he turns rebellious, seems to epitomise for the king all that a son should be. It is not so surprising that the king sees more to like in Hotspur than his own son, as he says, "Would that some night-tripping fairy had exchanged in cradle clothes our children where they lay, and called mine Percy his Plantagenet." However, it is family bonds that are the trigger for rebellion. Hotspur sees himself as fighting for his brother-in-law, Mortimer, who the king refuses to help. For many, Hotspur, portrayed as a highly strung knight with a volcanic temperament and a medieval outlook, is a far more interesting character than Prince Hal is, who in comparison, for most of the play, seems of a rather innocuous nature. Hotspur commands every scene he appears in, and although, depending on the interpretation, he might appear to be a petulant youth, even comic at times, his pithy assessments of others are usually on the mark. As he says on behalf of his brother-in-law, "But I will lift the downtrod Mortimer as high in the air as this unthankful king, as this ingrate and cankered Bolingbroke." His driven nature is all too obvious, and we might well dislike him for his insistence on dominating not only the forces at his control, but in his put down to his wife, and his desire even to bring nature under his means by his proposal to divert the channel of the River Trent to make the proposed division of the country more to his liking. Hot-headed, yes, but driven by cold ambition. Also on the side of the rebels is Owen Glendower, feared leader of the Welsh, but here shown as an esoteric sort of figure, called the heir of Merlin and said to be able to command the weather and the spirits of the Welsh lands. Much of this portrayal comes from Holinshed's Chronicles, where the tale of Glendower's defeat of Henry by invoking very bad weather on the day of a late summer battle is recounted. Also mentioned in the play is the fact that Glendower was educated and present in the English court before turning away from Henry, all of which is also supported by Holinshed. Ultimately, Glendower fails to bring his men to Hotspur in time, which has been interpreted as Shakespeare commenting on the unsteady relationship between England and Wales, which is also reflected in Hotspur's and Glendower's uneasy and volatile relationship. When Hotspur speaks of Glendower to Mortimer, who defends his father-in-law, we get some idea of the English view of the Welsh, and some wonderful Shakespearean imagery and language. Sometimes he angers me with telling me of the mould-rat and the ant, of the dreamer Merlin and his prophecies, and of a dragon and a finless fish, a clip-winged griffin and a molten raven, a crouching lion and a ramping cat, and such a deal of skimble-scamble stuff as puts me from my faith. I tell you what, he held me last night at least 9 hours in reckoning up the several devils' names that were his lackeys. I cried hum and well go to, but marked him not a word. Oh, he is as tedious as a tired horse, a railing wife, worse than a smoky house. I had rather live with cheese and garlic in a windmill, far, than feed on cates and have him talk with me in any summer-house in Christendom. The women in the play, high-born ladies Percy and Mortimer, and their lowly counterpart, the bedraggled Mistress Quickly, though they only have minor roles, are as diverse and convincingly drawn as any of the other characters. Mistress Quickly comes into her own in Henry IV Part 2 and The Merry Wives of Windsor, so we'll focus for the moment on the aristocratic ladies. The episode in Wales between the two young warriors, rash, impulsive Percy and Mortimer, and their amorous wives, offer a glimpse of how Shakespeare imagined their lives and perspectives. There is virtually no historical evidence for them. Lady Percy is a tempering but feisty presence, concerned as she is to dissuade her husband from his reckless plans for rebellion, even though she professes to understand his reasoning. As such, her role is the closest to that of the other Shakespearean wives and mothers that we've seen before. However, in this case, her words go unheeded, and in the end she is abandoned by Hotspur in his irritation with her. Strangely, at one point he calls her Kate for no obvious reason. We have to wonder if this was Shakespeare nodding to an earlier strong, argumentative character that he had created. Elizabeth Inchbold, who played Lady Percy, noted in her diary from 1807 that Hotspur paid more attention to his horse than his wife. But her presence does have an impact on the audience at least, thanks to a 30-line speech that for many years was often used as an audition piece by actresses. Having been included in The Beauties of Shakespeare, a collection of Shakespeare's speeches first published in 1752 and often reprinted, it faded from popularity in the 19th century. But reading it now, one cannot help but be struck by what a strangely beautiful description it is of post-traumatic stress disorder. "O my good Lord, why are you thus alone? For what offence have I this fortnight been a banished woman from my Harry's bed? Tell me, sweet Lord, what is it that takes from thee thy stomach, pleasure, and thy golden sleep? Why dost thou bend thine eyes upon the earth, and start so often when thou sittest alone? Why hast thou lost the fresh blood in thy cheeks, and given my treasures and my rights of thee to thick-eyed musing and cursed melancholy? In thy faint slumbers I by thee have watched and heard thee murmur tales of iron wars, speak terms of manage to thy bounding steed, cry courage to the field, and then hast talked of sallies and retires, of trenches, tents, of palisadoes, frontiers, parapets, of basilisks, of cannon, culverin, of prisoners' ransom, and of soldiers slain, and all the currents of a heady fight. Thy spirit within thee has been so at war, and thus hath so bestrided thee in thy sleep, that beads of sweat have stood upon thy brow, like bubbles in a late disturbed stream. And in thy face strange motions have appeared, such as we see when men restrain their breath on some great sudden hest. O what portents are these? Some heavy business hath my lord in hand, and I must know it, else he loves me not." Lady Mortimer, the Welsh-speaking daughter of Glendower, has no dialogue in the script, with the direction simply saying that she speaks in Welsh. The assumption is that there was a boy actor in the company at the time who could speak the language and sang well, and Shakespeare decided to take advantage of that. The part was often completely cut in the 18th and 19th centuries, but is usually restored in modern productions, showing Lady Mortimer as an emotional counterpoint to Lady Percy. She, by her father's translated account, is distraught at her husband's impending departure for war. When she cradles his head and sings him to a restful sleep, the contrast with Hotspur's restless nights could not be more obvious. Prince Hal can be seen as representing the difficult birth of a new kind of leadership. Where Hotspur is the medieval feudal past, Hal is the political leader of the future, where power moves away from the landed barons and settles with the monarch, very much in the mould of the Tudor dynasty. This is exactly what King Henry has been attempting to do, but thanks to his status as a usurper, he is bound to fail. However, that status does not convert to his son, who, as everyone in Shakespeare's audience knew, was, in their view, about to become one of England's greatest kings, thanks to his successful campaigns in France. But here, in this play, we have the young Prince Hal, happy to while away his time with dissolute friends. This aspect of Hal's story is mostly an invention of Shakespeare's. The historic record shows the prince to have been quite diligent in his royal and military duties, enough to have been a key player in the Battle of Shrewsbury at 16 years old. One did not get to be a good knight by shirking too many responsibilities. So, not only is Shakespeare using this portrayal of the youthful Hal to examine the father and son relationship, but to make Hal's eventual transformation into King Henry V even more dramatic. And that starts in this play, when realising the seriousness of the situation for the country and the dynasty, he takes his place by his father's side. In fact, we have already had a pointer that this was always the way that things were going to go, when at the end of Act 1, Scene 2 in Soliloquy, Hal predicts that he will abandon Falstaff and his friends. I know you all, and will awhile uphold the unyoked humour of your idleness. Yet herein, while I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that, when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapours that did seem to strangle him. If all the year were playing holidays, to sport would be as tedious as to work. But when they seldom come, they wished for come, and nothing pleaseth but rare accidents. So when this loose behaviour I throw off, and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes. And, like bright metal on sullen ground, my reformation glittering o'er my fault, shall show more godly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it off. I'll so offend to make offence a skill, redeeming time when men think least I will. We have to work through the second part of Henry IV and into the Henry V play before we see that final abandonment, and when it comes, it still seems harsh and cruel, but remember, the seed was planted here. In fact, in this play, Hal and Falstaff make a fascinating double act. Falstaff's lies and exaggerations are so blatant, Hal and Poins make only a little pretence at believing them. Falstaff seems unaware of their mockery, caught up as he is in his own alcoholic and sex-fuelled belief in himself. Falstaff's character is a descendant of the braggart soldier of the Greek and Roman theatre. In his person and his various antics, he is an anti-heroic treatment of the core events of the play. The revellers in the alehouse mock all that the court of the remote, lofty sovereign holds solemn. Falstaff's tongue may be sharp and his judgment sweeping, but it is nevertheless the shrewd voice of common sense, making him a sort of everyman for the common people. He is the ruler of his own sort of court, with his own idea of his undoubted self-importance being expressed in the line, "I am not only witty in myself, but the cause of wit in other men." But his concerns are those of the common man. Where will his next meal and, more importantly, his next drink come from? Will he have a roof over his head for the night and company in his bed? It is no surprise he has become the most popular comic character, for some the most popular of all characters in Shakespeare. Most importantly of all, he is funny, even 400 years on, with his earthy, cynical philosophy. Counterpointing the courtly characters in their view of honour and bravery, he says to his companion Francis, "You rogue, there's lime in this sack too. There is nothing but roguery to be found in villainous men, yet a coward is worse than a cup of sack with lime in it. A villainous coward! Go thy ways, old Jack, die when thou wilt. If manhood, good manhood, be not forgot upon the face of the earth, then am I a shotted herring. There lives not 3 good men unhanged in England, and one of them is fat and grows old, God help the while. A bad word, I say, a word. I would I were a weaver, I could sing psalms or anything. A plague of all cowards, I say still. And then, while feigning death on the battlefield, and after hearing Hal eulogise him as a fake and a fraud, he famously says, I am no counterfeit. To die is to be a counterfeit, for he is but the counterfeit of a man who hath not the life of a man. But to counterfeit dying, when a man thereby liveth, is to be no counterfeit, but the true and perfect image of life indeed. The better part of valour is discretion, in the which better part I have saved my life. In theatrical terms, with Falstaff and his companions, Shakespeare was leaning into the tradition of the anti-mask, and, going further back, into the world of the Lord of Misrule, where the lowest were temporarily allowed to be in control. Parody is a significant tool at Falstaff's disposal, and he is very brave, or perhaps very foolish, certainly overconfident, in his portrayal, his parody, of kings and princes. Never before had historical drama included such parody within itself, nor provided such a broad view of Elizabethan society in one snapshot, from the king to princes and nobles to the Falstaffs, the Shallows and the Pistols. Falstaff in Shakespeare's original form was called Sir John Oldcastle. In the anonymous play from 1588, The Famous Victories of Henry V, he appears as a close companion of the king, and it is likely from this source that Shakespeare continues that tradition and the name. The historical Oldcastle was born about 1370 into a politically active family, his grandfather having served Richard II. He fought in Henry IV's campaigns in Wales, and later became a close friend and supporter of the Prince of Wales. By then a major landowner in Herefordshire and Kent through marriage, Oldcastle fought in France in campaigns organised by Prince Henry. Although Henry's accession to the throne in 1413 might have led to a very favourable position for Oldcastle, he had by then adopted the teachings of John Wycliffe and the Lollards, who were particularly strong in his Kent and Herefordshire heartlands. He was accused of heresy, but the king refused to progress the prosecution until he had made a personal appeal to the knight. Oldcastle submitted to the king in all things, but then fled from Windsor Castle, forcing Henry to act against him. Oldcastle repeatedly refused to appear before the Archbishop of Canterbury, and only attended the ecclesiastical court when a royal writ demanding his presence was issued. He was found guilty of heresy and condemned to burn at the stake. But Henry issued a 40-day reprieve, hoping that his friend would recant, but Oldcastle only used the hiatus to escape from the Tower of London. He joined Lollard forces who were planning rebellion and advanced plans to capture the king before placing himself as regent to oversee the taking down of the organised church in line with Lollard principles. The Lollard army was easily overwhelmed by Henry's superior forces, and Oldcastle spent 4 years in hiding before he was finally captured. He was hung for treason, and his body then burned for heresy. In the Elizabethan era, although Protestantism had moved on from Lollardy, Oldcastle was still remembered as a revered early Protestant hero. He featured in Fox's Book of Martyrs. A descendant of Oldcastle's, Lord Cobham, objected to his portrayal as a drunken and comic knight, and Shakespeare renamed the character. Interestingly, at one point Hal refers to Falstaff as "my old lad of the castle," retaining a reference to the earlier name. Falstaff's companions are also renamed versions from the earlier play. Harvey and Russell become Bardolph and Peto, probably to avoid offending the Earl of Bedford, whose surname was Russell, and Sir William Harvey. Falstaff remains an enduring character and went on to feature in 2 more plays, with his ghost hanging over the third, all of which we will get to soon. He stands out as Shakespeare's most prolific comic character, perhaps best summed up when Samuel Johnson said of him, "Falstaff, unimitated, unimitable, How shall I extol thee? Thou compound a sense of vice, a sense of which may be admitted but not esteemed, of vice which may be despised but hardly detested. Falstaff, for many, took over from Prince Hal as the central character of the play, whatever Shakespeare's intentions were. In 1699, it is recorded by one James Wright that he could remember the applause that actor John Lowen received for the part before the theatres were closed. Even during the interregnum, the part was remembered in the droll The Bouncing Knight. Given its theme of the defeat of rebellion, it is perhaps not surprising that it was one of the first of the Shakespeare plays that were revived after the Restoration. Samuel Pepys records it as one of his particular favourites. Through the next couple of centuries, the focus of the play changed from Falstaff to Hal or to Hotspur and back again at the dictates of the preferences of the actor-managers of the times, but it was pretty much always somewhere in the repertoire. Less in favour in Victorian times thanks to the tavern scenes and displays of drunkenness leading to robbery, it was still occasionally performed with emphasis put on the pageantry of the nobles and the battle scenes. Most actors have desired to work their way through Hal, Hotspur and Falstaff, as the play was given regular major revivals in more recent times. It has remained popular in the United Kingdom, but less so abroad, where the history of the play is perhaps less compelling. It remains a matter of debate as to whether Shakespeare wrote parts 1 and 2 of Henry IV with both in mind as a complete piece. The two parts are tightly bound together and probably composed only a year or two apart. With a wealth of historical material and characters of his own creation to work into the plot, it seems likely that he never would have attempted to tell the whole story of Henry's reign and Hal's rise in one play. But Part 2 may only have become viable once Part 1 proved a success. What is impressive is that both parts are dramatically complete of themselves, but also follow a very satisfying dramatic arc when seen as a closely linked pair. Next time, we are heading back to the medieval theatre with a guest episode, and then we will continue with Shakespeare's version of English history with the story of the second part of the reign of King Henry IV. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.